Today I'm looking at writing advice from Amanda Gorman, who was America's first youth poet laureate and famously recited her poem The Hill We Climb at Joe Biden's inauguration. Normally I just cover fiction authors, but I found Amanda's thoughts on writing really valuable and pretty much universal to the pursuit of writing in general. So here's some of her tips for writers. Number 1, you have to be okay with sitting down and recognising you're not trying to write something great in this moment. You're trying to write, and the greatness will come in itself from that. This is one of those things that sometimes gets really hard to remember when you're writing. I, for one, will always sit down and I think I'm going to write the best thing I've ever written. Every time I sit down, that's my aim. And really, that's kind of unhealthy when you think about it. Nobody can perform at that level so consistently. I just don't think it's possible from a creative perspective. But setting yourself the task of just beginning to write, just starting, just engaging with it, I think is way more realistic and somewhat more healthy. By always aiming to write something great, you're setting the bar really high for yourself. And the chances of failure are subsequently much higher as well. That could easily lead to frustration, I think, and it's not much further down the line that you reach demotivation. It's really hard not to assess the value of your writing as you're writing it. It's really hard not to think about whether it's what you want it to be or whether it's up to the standard that you really want. The likelihood is you're probably comparing that writing to other writing that you love, other stories or other books, or even things that you've finished yourself. But the difference is those things are finished. They've gone through multiple drafts, they've been looked at by probably a whole host of people, and that's why they're so good. The first drafts of those stories and books probably weren't great immediately either. One of the biggest blocks for me when I'm writing is how much I think about efficiency. Is this the right story for me to be writing right now? Because it's not coming out 100% perfect. Maybe if I move to a different story, that one will be perfect. Or if I approach this differently, it'll be perfect. I spend a lot of time assessing my own writing as I go along, when really that time would be much better spent finishing stories that I can then edit and make much better. So I definitely agree with this tip. Just sit down and write. The rest will follow. Number 2, read everything 3 times. For pleasure, to learn from the writer's style, and then to think about how you could write it better. This is a good practical tip to improve your craft, I think, and while you can't read everything that you read 3 times, because there just aren't enough hours in the day, I think if it's something that you particularly love, or something that you particularly hate, this could be really useful. How many times have you reread your favourite book and found things that you'd missed the first time or the second time? It happens quite a lot. There's always stuff to be learned from something, even if you've read it before. So taking that first read just to enjoy the story, absolutely. And then after that, you can start looking at it with a more critical eye. I like to do this with some of my favourite books, which in some ways led to this series of famous authors writing advice, because I look at how people do things and what I can learn from them. And I take lines from the books that I love and figure out what's so great about them. It may sound a little bit like stealing, but it's not really. By the time you've taken that skill or that technique and applied it to your own story using your own phrasing and your own natural wording, it becomes something totally different, but it's still a great advantage to your story, I find. And that third reason to read things through, to think about how you could write it better, I think that taps into a central problem with most writers, the juxtaposition between your confidence in your story and your self-doubt in your own ability. It might feel slightly arrogant to think you could take your favourite book down off the shelf, pluck a line from it and think, I could write that better. Thing is though, it's not always about better. That exercise of evaluation really just helps you understand what you think is important as a writer and what you value and how you approach things. The evaluation isn't really on that other author, it's on you. And how you approach story and how you put into practice all these skills and techniques that you've learned. Unless, of course, it's a book that you think is really terrible, in which case you can absolutely go through it and figure out what things you would do better with a little bit more confidence. But it still takes quite a lot of self-belief to do that, because once you see something's been published, you assume it's of a certain quality, though that might not always be the case. So this 1, 2, 3 step, read for pleasure, learn from the writer's technique and figure out what you would have done differently. Yeah, I think it's really useful. I'd say pick a favourite story or a favourite chapter and sit down and try it if you ever get stuck with your writing, because you'll definitely learn something one way or the other. Number 3, I do try not to force edits. Instead, I focus on what is the feeling that I want the reader or ear to receive from this poem, the gift. This aligns really well with my approach to writing, I think. It's all about what is important about the story, and that is your message or your meaning that you want to communicate to whoever's reading or listening to it. It's really tempting, especially when you're editing a first draft, to get down to the nitty-gritty and think about exactly how you can rephrase something for maximum efficiency, or to make it sound nicer or make it sound more lyrical. But the thing is, that stuff is less important than communicating that message to whoever's reading it. If you lose that message or that meaning, or it becomes muddy or blurry because you've over-edited, then really the nice editing and the nice phrasing, it really doesn't have as much value. When I first started writing, I found this idea really difficult to get to grips with. Just stating things simply and concisely in plain English really didn't feel like writing to me. Everything I'd learned in school was about beautiful phrasing or lyrical writing, or how the author had achieved this particular effect by the language that they'd used and the onomatopoeia and the assonance and all that stuff. But the thing is, although that's important, I just don't think it's as important as getting a message across to a reader, because not many readers are going to read a story and then go, I really love the assonance in that story. They're going to say, I really loved how that story made me feel. So getting that feeling across should always be priority number one as far as I'm concerned, and clearly as far as Amanda Gorman's concerned as well. Readers are interested in story, not the craft of writing. There's definitely stories that are writers writing, where other writers will appreciate it more because of some of the things you've done, or some of the things you've achieved, or the way you've approached things. But readers are unlikely to pick up on that. What they will recognise is how that story makes them feel. Of course, everything that you put into writing goes to craft that feeling, but as long as you keep it in your mind, in the forefront of your mind when you're writing, I think that it translates to the reader one way or the other. Even if they don't know exactly how you're making them feel this way or that way, I think it still comes across. Whatever genre or subject matter or form that you're writing in, I think it's always a good idea to prioritise the feeling that you're giving to your readers, so I strongly agree with that tip. Number 4, I usually try to write for at least 15 minutes a day, or about 300 words a day. I'm not big on writing targets myself, and I don't write every day. It just doesn't fit into my writing routine, I suppose. But I think 300 words or 15 minutes is a really good target to aim for. The reason why I say that is because I think 300 words or 15 minutes is enough time or enough words to figure out whether it's going to work for you that particular day or not. For me, there's nothing worse than trying to push through and write something when I'm really just not getting anything out of it. That's really hard, and I find it demotivating. It makes the next time I come to write feel even more difficult than the current time. I don't know too much about poetry, and I probably should, but there's probably a big difference between 300 words of poetry and 300 words of novel writing. But 15 minutes of writing is 15 minutes of writing, whatever it is that you're doing, and I think it's long enough where you can settle in and soon realise you've gone way past the 15-minute mark. And it's also only 15 minutes of agony if you're really unable to produce anything at all. It's not a huge chunk of your day. You can still go and do something else, read or study writing, or figure something else out that might help you next time you sit down. I've had writing targets before, 1,000 words a day, 2,000 words a day, and while I've hit them, it hasn't really made me feel all that good. And the writing I produced also wasn't really all that good. The only value that really brought me was I was able to think I'm 1% further through my novel, and that really wasn't much motivation for me. I would much rather spend 15 minutes or 300 words writing something that I really love than 2 hours a day or 2,000 words of just hard graft, getting it done for the sake of getting it done. All writers are different, of course. This is just my method to writing, for whatever that's worth. But I think aiming for 15 minutes of writing a day might work for all kinds of writers. On the one hand, if you haven't got that much time or you can't concentrate for a long time, then 15 minutes is enough to get something down and to make some progress and to write a few lines that you really like. On the other hand, if 15 minutes then turns into a mammoth stint of writing where you spend hours and hours getting not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of words down, then great. That 15 minutes was just the beginning of that. Either way, seems like a good aim to me, so I agree with this point as well. Number 5. Many young writers think that in order to be a writer, you have to have your work published in X, Y, and Z locations. That's not what it means to be a writer. It's a continuous journey that occurs before and after publication. The definition of what exactly a writer is something that I find really interesting, and there's a lot of different points of view on it. The one that stands out the most to me and that I identify with the most is that there's no such thing as an aspiring writer. To me, if you're writing stuff, whether that's for yourself or you're aiming to get published, whatever the case, that to me makes you a writer. How good you are at it, how long you've been doing it, how much you put into it, I don't think really matters. I don't think there are qualifiers that mean you're a writer or you're not. I've seen arguments that say you can't call yourself an author until you're traditionally published, but who really cares? As far as I'm concerned, call yourself whatever you want as long as you're sitting down and doing some writing and trying to create stories that mean something to you and that you hope might mean something to somebody else. The way I look at it, it seems really unfair that a celebrity who has a ghost-written book and doesn't really write a word of it gets called an author, whereas someone who sits at their desk and writes story after story or novel after novel, even though they're not published, they don't get to call themselves an author or they don't get to call themselves a writer. That doesn't make sense to me. In my opinion, I think it's intention that makes all the difference. If you want to create stories and you want to bring them to life and you want to work at your craft and have that continuous journey as she talks about, then to me, that absolutely makes you a writer. There is no aspiring in that because you're doing it. Sitting down and figuring out a story, getting all the moving parts working, getting everything moving in the right direction, is the same whether you're published or you're not published. So what difference does it make? It's not publishers or the publishing industry or other people on the internet that tell you if you're a writer or not. It's you. You get to decide that, and you get to put it into practice with all the hard work that you put into your stories or your novel or whatever it is that you're writing. If you are writing but you don't feel like a legitimate writer and you don't feel like a real writer, I'd really spend some time trying to figure out why that is if you can. You absolutely are a writer and you have the right to call yourself that. Whether you keep your writing completely a secret or you tell people about it, that also doesn't matter. You get to decide whether you're a writer. That's something that happens within yourself and nowhere else. So, as you can tell, I quite strongly agree with that point. Number 6. Rarely does a good idea come right when you want it to. Instead, you have to wait, lovingly preparing a place for inspiration to strike in your life, so when it does, it can thrive. You can tell from this tip how much Amanda Gorman's thought about her own writing process and her own creativity, because this links so well into her 15 minutes a day or 300 words a day tip. She talks about waiting here and creating a place for inspiration to strike, and that 15 minutes or those 300 words every day is exactly the space. I've heard a lot of writers and I've seen a lot of writers' tips that say you can't wait for the muse, you have to engage yourself with writing and get going in order to really make it a habit and make it consistent and keep outputting valuable words. And I really do believe in that, even if I can't necessarily put it into practice myself. I can see that from both sides because sometimes I do feel inspired to write a story and then I'll write one and I'll really enjoy what I'm doing and I like the end product. But other times I don't feel that inspiration and I sit down and I do still end up writing something that I really like. I've already proved myself wrong in a couple of videos about what creates better writing, inspiration or hard work and perspiration. I'll link those videos up in the top there. I still think 15 minutes is enough to catch that inspiration and get something down, even if you don't have hours and hours to devote to writing every day. It doesn't mean you have to give up on this pursuit or this hobby. It just means scale it back a little bit, but make sure you're still just keeping your hand in and getting something done consistently. Even if you don't really write much or you don't really get anything down that you really love, the point is doing it. Consistently achieving something by your writing. Doesn't matter what the quality is. Just matters that you're putting in the hours to try to do it, to try to improve and to just keep it going. I think if you can do that, then the good ideas, as she says, will eventually come. There might be some bad ones here and there as well, there certainly is for me, but you learn something from everything you write. If this was useful, I'd love it if you could click the thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching as always, and happy writing.